Hello and welcome to EBible Fellowship's Evening Bible Studies with your speaker, Chris McCann. If you'd like more information or to hear more studies, visit our website at www.ebiblefellowship.com. And now, with your evening Bible study, here's Chris McCann.
Good evening and welcome to EBible Fellowship's Bible study in the book of Revelation. Tonight is study number 8 of Revelation chapter 18, and we're continuing to look in verse 3. For all nations have drunk of the wine of the wrath of her fornication, and the kings of the earth have committed fornication with her, and the merchants of the earth are waxed rich through the abundance of her delicacies. And Babylon is the one being referred to as the one who the nations of the world have drank from the wine of her fornication. It is Babylon. We've seen similar language to the first part of this verse in previous chapters of Revelation. If we go back to Revelation chapter 14, it says in verse 8, "And there followed another angel, saying, Babylon is fallen, that great city, because she made all nations drink of the wine of the wrath of her fornication." And also in Revelation chapter 17, in verse 2, "With whom the kings of the earth have committed fornication, and the inhabitants of the earth have been made drunk with the wine of her fornication." And then in verse 4 of Revelation 17, "And the woman was arrayed in purple and scarlet color, and decked with gold and precious stones and pearls, having a golden cup in her hand, full of abominations and filthiness of her fornications." And that's the cup of her fornication that the nations of the world have drank from. And it is in their drinking of the cup of this fornication and abomination that God has prepared the world for the final judgment. In loosing Satan, God is the one who set these things in motion, and at the same time God removed or lifted his hand of restraint to a great degree off the hearts of men, allowing them to go after their sinful desires they've always wanted to do, but now they were unrestrained and went after them full force. And so we find ourselves presently living in a world where Sunday is like any other day of the week. It no longer is recognized by the people of the world as a day set apart. Or we find ourselves living in a world where men marry men and women marry women as though it's typical and everything is fine, yet it is completely contrary to the law of God. And many other things that the world is currently doing, sinful activities that they were not so prone to do in generations past. But now at the time of the end, through the loosing of Satan, God allowed Satan to receive greater worship in the church from the unsaved in the congregations and in the world. As people serve sin, they serve Satan also to a higher degree. And that was all part of his loosing. Now we read in Jeremiah chapter 51. In Jeremiah 51, in verses 7 and 8, it says, "Babylon hath been a golden cup in Jehovah's hand, that made all the earth drunken. The nations have drunken of her wine, therefore the nations are mad." And then in verse 8, "Babylon is suddenly fallen and destroyed. How for her? Take balm for her pain, if so be she may be healed." So again, just as in Revelation 14, verse 8, Babylon is fallen, and then God mentions this golden cup that Babylon has caused the nations to drink of, and it identifies with Satan's rule during the 23-year Great Tribulation period when he is called the beast, and he is getting great glory from the people, from the nations of the world, from all the unsaved inhabitants of the earth. And this is preparing, and of course at this point has prepared, the unsaved people for the final judgment. And that's where we find ourselves now. The world has drunk from the cup of fornication. The world is mad. It's said there, notice that again in Jeremiah 51 in verse 7, that the nations have drunken of her wine, therefore the nations are mad. Now over in Jeremiah 50, God uses the same word mad in verse 38. And it says in that verse, a drought is upon her waters, and they shall be dried up, for it is the land of graven images, and they are mad upon their idols. So concerning idolatry, they are mad, God says, in their doing service to them. And that's all related to drinking of the cup of fornication out of Babylon's hand, and the world has been given over to idolatry. Remember, God calls covetous idolatry. That would be the spiritual aspect of idolatry. A person doesn't have to carve a tree and make an image and deck it with gold and silver and set it on their mantle or on their front lawn and bow down to it. No, covetousness, lusting and coveting after things of the world can be just as idolatrous, and that is more of the nature of idolatry today with mankind. It's an idol that's within their heart. It's idols that are in their minds, and as they crave and they lust after the things of the world. And it's one of the reasons why God in Revelation 18, in speaking of the fall of Babylon, well, let's look at the rest of verse 3 here in Revelation 18. For all nations have drunk of the wine of the wrath of her fornication, and the kings of the earth have committed fornication with her, and the merchants of the earth are waxed rich through the abundance of her delicacies. So it's not just the kings of the earth, and we've discussed that phrase before, but the merchants of the earth. And actually, once we get into this chapter a little bit deeper, we're going to see that there are woes pronounced. The word woe is translated alas, and it's found 3 times, and it's doubled each time. Alas, alas, or woe, woe. Just as Revelation 8:13, in making that transition from the judgment upon the churches to the judgment of the world, said, woe, woe, woe to the inhabitants of the earth. 3 woes were pronounced, and then we went into chapter 9 and following, and the 3 woes dealt with Judgment Day. Well, in a sense, there are 3 woes that are recorded here in Revelation 18, and each woe is doubled, just like Babylon is fallen. Alas, alas. And God addresses a certain group of people before pronouncing the woe. Actually, there's pretty much a pattern that's established. If we look at verse 9 of Revelation 18, and the kings of the earth who have committed fornication and lived deliciously with her shall bewail her and lament for her when they shall see the smoke of her burning, standing afar off for the fear of her torment, saying, Alas, alas, that great city, Babylon, that mighty city, for in 1 hour is thy judgment come. So that was addressed to the kings of the earth, and we also have the kings of the earth mentioned here in verse 3. But then notice verse 11, and the merchants of the earth, and that's the people we have also in verse 3, and the merchants of the earth are waxed rich through the abundance of her delicacies. Well, here in verse 11, God, after addressing the kings of the earth, now addresses the merchants of the earth. And the merchants of the earth shall weep and mourn over her, for no man buyeth their merchandise any more. The merchandise of gold and silver, and precious stones, and of pearls, and fine linen, and purple, and silk, and scarlet, and all thine wood, and all manner of vessels of ivory, and all manner of vessels of most precious wood, and of brass, and iron, and marble, and cinnamon, and odors, and ointments, and frankincense, and wine, and oil, and fine flour, and wheat, and beasts, and sheep, and horses, and chariots, and slaves, and souls of men, and the fruits that thy soul lusted after are departed from thee, and all things which were dainty and goodly are departed from thee, and thou shalt find them no more at all. The merchants of these things, which were made rich by her, shall stand afar off, for the fear of her torment, weeping and wailing, and saying, Alas, alas, that great city that was clothed in fine linen and purple and scarlet, and decked with gold and precious stones and pearls, for in 1 hour so great riches is come to naught. And then there's a third group that is headed up by shipmasters, and actually is the rest of verse 17, and every shipmaster and the company and ships and sailors and as many as trade by the sea stood afar off and cried. And then they are weeping and wailing and saying, Alas, alas. So there's three groups. There's the kings of the earth, the merchants of the earth, and then the shipmasters and company and ships. Each one stands afar off. Each one wails or weeps and mourns. Each one cries, Alas, alas. And at the conclusion of addressing each one of them, it says, In 1 hour is thy judgment come, or it says, in 1 hour so great riches is come to naught. So it's a pattern that God repeats 3 times, addressing these 3 different groups. And he is again speaking of Babylon, the kingdom of Satan, which is the kingdoms of this world. It's the nations of the world. It's the people of the world. And God is addressing them or identifying them as merchants of the earth. And we wonder, well, why? Why does God speak of the people of the world as merchants of the earth? We understand when it comes to the gospel that God likens himself to a merchant man. And then, as he says in that wonderful verse in Isaiah 55, come without money and without price and buy, because he freely gives the gospel, and yet he uses the language of buying and selling, the language of a merchant, insofar as dealing in the gospel. And the gospel merchandise is part of Babylon, because Babylon conquered Judah, or Satan conquered the church, and the church became another one of the provinces. Historically, we know that Judah became one of the many provinces or conquered nations that Babylon ruled over. And the corporate church became another kingdom that Satan ruled over. He ruled over the nations, and now he added to it the corporate church entire. Finally, he was the sole ruler over the churches and congregations of the world. And so there was buying and selling and merchandising of the gospel going on within the church. And that does relate to this language in Revelation 18, especially that one verse we read where they deal in souls of men, but there's more to it. It's not just the church, it's the world also that is involved heavily in merchandising. For instance, if we go back to Ezekiel chapter 27, we'll start there. We read of Tyrus, and Tyrus is a picture of mankind or of the world. It says in Ezekiel 27 in verse 2, "Now thou son of man, take up a lamentation for Tyrus, and say unto Tyrus, O thou that art situate at the entry of the sea, which art a merchant of the people for many isles, thus saith the Lord Jehovah, O Tyrus, thou hast said, I am of perfect beauty, and so forth." Now, if you read Ezekiel 27, you're going to read again and again that the context is describing the involvement of Tyrus with merchants. For instance, it says in verse 8, "The inhabitants of Zidon and Arvad were thy mariners. Thy wise men, O Tyrus, that were in thee were thy pilots." Verse 9, "The ancients of Gebel and the wise men thereof were in thee thy caulkers. All the ships of the sea with their mariners were in thee to occupy thy merchandise." And then in verse 12, "Tarshish was thy merchant by reason of the multitude of all kind of riches, with silver, iron, tin, and lead. They traded in thy fairs. Javel, Tubal, and Meshach, they were thy merchants. They traded the persons of men and vessels of brass in thy market. They of the house of Togarmah traded in thy fairs with horses and horsemen and mules. The men of Dedan were thy merchants. Many isles were the merchandise of thine hand. They brought thee for a present horns of ivory and ebony. Syria was thy merchant by reason of the multitude of the wares of thy making. They occupied in thy fairs with emeralds, purple, embroidered work, and fine linen, and coral, and agate. Judah and the land of Israel were thy merchants. They traded in thy market wheat of Minnith, and Penag, and honey, and oil, and balm. Damascus was thy merchant, in the multitude of the wares of thy making, for the multitude of all riches, in the wine of Hebron, and white wool. Dan also and Javan, going to and fro, occupied in thy fairs. Bright iron, cassia, and calamus were in thy market. Dedan was thy merchant, in precious clothes for chariots. Arabia, and all the princes of Kedar, they occupied with thee in lambs, and rams, and goats. In these were they thy merchants. The merchants of Sheba and Raamah, they were thy merchants. They occupied in thy fairs with chief of all spices, and with all precious stones and gold, and it goes on, Haran, and so forth. They were thy merchants. Verse 24, "These were thy merchants in all sorts of things, in blue clothes, embroidered work, in chests of rich apparel, bound with cords and made of cedar, among thy merchandise. The ships of Tarshish did sing of thee in thy market, and thou wast replenished, and made very glorious in the midst of the seas." This is like a business report. It's speaking of Tyrus involved with this nation and that nation and the other nation. They were thy merchants. It seemed that Tyrus was involved in trading and merchandising with all the nations, because Tyrus points to mankind. And we know this from Ezekiel 28. And in Ezekiel 28, in verse 2, "Son of man, say unto the prince of Tyrus, Thus saith the Lord Jehovah, because thine heart is lifted up, and thou hast said, I am a God. I sit in the seat of God, in the midst of the seas. Yet thou art a man, and not God. though thou set thine heart as the heart of God. Behold, thou art wiser than Daniel. There is no secret that they can hide from thee. With thy wisdom and with thine understanding thou hast gotten thee riches, and hast gotten gold and silver into thy treasures, by thy great wisdom and by thy traffic. Traffic is a translation. It's Strong's number 7404 of the same Hebrew word, translated as merchandise. And by thy traffic or merchandise hast thou increased thy riches, and thine heart is lifted up because of thy riches, because of thy merchandise. The heart of man is lifted up. And just to prove this is man, in Ezekiel 28, it says in verse 12, Son of man, take up a lamentation upon the king of Tyrus, and say unto him, Thus saith the Lord Jehovah, Thou sealest up the sum, full of wisdom, and perfect in beauty. Thou hast been in Eden, the garden of God. Every precious stone was thy covering, the sardius, topaz, and the diamond, the beryl, the onyx, and the jasper, the sapphire, the emerald, and the carbuncle, and gold. The workmanship of thy tabrets and of thy pipes was prepared in thee in the day that thou wast created. So Tyrus was in the Garden of Eden and was created. And then God says in verse 14 of Ezekiel 28, Thou art the anointed cherub that covereth, and I have set thee so. Thou wast upon the holy mountain of God. Thou hast walked up and down in the midst of the stones of fire. Only man qualifies to be called the anointed cherub, as God is himself likened to cherubims, and the cherub identifies with cherubims, with God. Mankind was created in the image of God, and it can only be Satan or man, and Satan is not, or was not, the anointed cherub. He was not created in God's image in any way. Well, it says in verse 15 of Ezekiel 28, Thou wast perfect in thy ways from the day that thou wast created, till iniquity was found in thee. By the multitude of thy merchandise they have filled the midst of thee with violence, and thou hast sinned. Therefore I will cast thee as profane out of the mountain of God, or out of the kingdom of God, and I will destroy thee, O covering cherub, from the midst of the stones of fire. And God did judge mankind because of their sin, though they were created good, and God cast him out of the kingdom, and that's why it's through salvation that a man or woman is translated into the kingdom of God's dear Son, because we're outside the kingdom due to the fall. And so we see that Tyrus was in the Garden of Eden, was created, fell into sin, is called the anointed cherub. It must be man. It must be man who had an intimate, close, personal relationship with God, just as the corporate church did. But this was the initial beginning relationship between mankind and God. And then that relationship was broken. So God, in speaking of mankind, or speaking of Tyrus as a merchant, as someone dealing in all manner of wares and in trades with all the nations of the world, he is putting his finger on the problem that mankind has. Mankind's covetous nature, his lusting and desiring after the things of the world. God warns, love not the world, neither the things of the world. Well, how's that go in 1 John in chapter 2, in verse 16? For all that is in the world, the lust of the flesh, and the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life, is not of the Father, but is of the world. And the world passeth away, and the lust thereof, but he that doeth the will of God abideth forever. That's basically the image that God is presenting in Revelation 18 when he speaks of the merchants of the earth and all the merchandise that they dealt in, all the wonderful things of the world. They love the world and the things of the world. But now has come the fall of Babylon. Now has come Judgment Day. And now comes the removal of these things, the taking away of Babylon's merchandise, the destruction of all of her earthly treasures, all of their sinful pleasures of mankind. Now just think of the world. Think of the world we live in, the world we're familiar with. If you're having a little trouble seeing Babylon, the merchant city, Babylon, and the merchants of the earth representing mankind, just think of how important the stock market is in this world. Or think of the malls, the stores that are everywhere, and they're constantly open. They want to be open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week now. Yes, on the Lord's Day, Sunday, no problem. We're here, we're operating, we're ready for business. Or think of the TV commercials or the radio commercials, constantly bombarding the listener or the viewer with advertising. What is advertising but merchandising? Buy this, buy that. We're selling this at a discount. We have a sale going on. Or think of the holidays. What has Thanksgiving become, except the day after is Black Friday, a time of great merchandising. Or the Christmas holiday season is a time to go shopping, to buy. That is the constant refrain, the constant theme of the world is buying and selling, the merchandising, buying houses and cars and gadgets and clothes, and you need money. Money is what allows you to operate in the world, to buy these things. Yes, the world is full of merchants.
Thanks for joining us for EBible Fellowship's Evening Bible Studies. You can hear these studies Monday through Friday over Paltalk, Skype, EBible Fellowship's webcast audio, or over your phone. For more information or to hear other studies, visit www.ebiblefellowship.com. Until our next study, may the Lord's perfect will be done.